Hi, this is Peggy from Roar. So today we have a great guest with us. So this is Corby Fine. Corby is a VP Digital at GoEasy. So GoEasy is a publicly traded financial services that offer a variety of lending products to consumers. So Corby was kind enough to fill in the survey, and we're going to discuss now what is the new normal in financial services from his perspective. So thank you so much, Corby. First question. So from your perspective, what are the major lasting impacts that COVID will have on financial services?
Yeah, financial services has had such a dependency on the human interaction, the conversation, the building trust, especially in a world where we're dealing with lending products, large sums of money, and a lot of the verification, authentication of the relationship, of the needs of the consumer are often achieved in that human conversation. You think about physical verification, you think about ID cards, you think about the legacy of signature cards in a bank branch. And in a world where we start to move to a more virtual society en masse, we think about how do those things start to impact on the financial services face-to-face relationship. Branches, are they needed in the same volume anymore when people aren't going to be going out as much? And the minute you start to remove those physical entities, you start to have to rethink all of the different ways in which you have a touch point experience with the consumer. So I think that the physical component is one of the major areas of disruption and permanent change. I think the second area is more around the risk tolerance that financial institutions are going to be willing to take in a world where there's a lot more uncertainty in terms of employment stability, in terms of income stability, and how do you start to change all of the fundamentals of the risk models that you use to drive the decisioning in your business, when not only do you have the issues of consumer employment and sort of the general economic situation, but then you've also got this inability to actually sit down and have a conversation. So those two things together, I think, are going to be fairly permanent.
So in that context, do you think that some of the regulations, policy will have to change to accommodate what you just mentioned?
Yeah, you can start to see the potential for regulations to come in around almost enforcing that FIs can't say no just to say no. And how do governments and industry get together to make certain things easier and remove friction? So for instance, banks interpret, especially in Canada, but globally, they interpret the regulatory bodies' instructions on AML and verification and things like that. I think we need to have a much better, very direct explanation of what those things are supposed to mean in the new world, particularly when we're going to have to start to trust the sort of non-face-to-face verification methods. So like, what is an approved validation method? And if I can log into my government tax return form, is that not good enough for a bank? If I can log into a different bank, is that not good enough for the third-party bank to reference and leverage? So how do we actually come together? And can government and regulatory bodies actually mandate that to make things easier for the customer?
Yeah, and when you think also the fact that the world is getting more and more global, having things that are allowed in the UK, not allowed in Canada, assessed differently in Australia, that gets extremely complicated as well. So
yeah, I think the other challenge to that though then becomes, will we for the next 5 to 10 years see as much global migration and movement? And if not, is that the counter argument to say maybe there is more sort of domestic decisioning that needs to happen?
yeah, that's and it's always interesting to see the impact. For example, I'm from France, and so some of the regulation actually from France still apply to me because I'm a French citizen. So now I'm
Mm-hmm.
here, so it's there is a lot of complexity there. In terms of staying in the global mindset, in terms of global financial stability, global financial order, what do you see in terms of high level of debt, obviously cyber attacks, US, China? What do you see the new game plan is going to be?
Yeah, it's a good question. Part of where we're at right now, looking globally, is what numbers do we trust? And I think it starts with as governments and industry aren't necessarily being completely forthright on the situation they're dealing with regards to COVID, how does that translate into true economic reporting? And so when a state or a government is declaring a GDP next year, how much of that was artificially inflated based on literally, the mint printing money to keep an economy afloat? And how do we forecast that downstream when every single country in the world is facing the same issue? I think about, new immigrants. Like Canada, pre-COVID, had a fairly large immigration number. I think by 2050, it was somewhere in the realm of another 6 to 7 million Canadians or people coming into Canada from 3 or 4 primary markets: China, Philippines, and Nigeria, I believe, are the 3 largest. Or India, sorry, China, India, and Nigeria. And when we think about that, and we think about all of that shut down, or at least slowed down in terms of progress, I think on a global basis, we are going to see a lot more domestic focus on internal economies. I think you're going to see governments start to fund industries that maybe those domestic economies don't normally have. You can see it here domestically in Canada, where we're going to start to have to think about things like refining our own oil. We're going to have to think about things like building our own PPE devices for building up medical safety infrastructure. And other industries are going to go away that we have an overabundance of because there was a dependency on export. And so, just take a personal opinion. When's the last time you tried to order something from, AliExpress or from a Chinese a domestic manufacturer? What used to take 7 to 9 days is now taking 2 to 3 months. And so people in a world where we're accustomed to like instant gratification, it's going to be at some point cheaper and beneficial to the local economy to actually just rebuild that infrastructure here. So I think that's more the impact. I think it's more about shifting the focus of the kinds of businesses that government's willing to fund and incubate domestically.
Well, and it's interesting from the perspective of we in technology are using a lot of people who are coming from abroad. So now if you're saying, well, we're not taking people from abroad anymore, or at least as much, what does it mean for a lot of our technology needs and all these large organizations that actually are using Canada as, a footprint? So yeah, an interesting conversation as well, yeah.
Yeah.
Changing gear. So in terms of resetting competitive positioning, so I love crisis because it allows, maybe people who are not incumbents to have a chance at the title. So what do you think the new competitive order might be? What type of organization you think is gonna benefit from the crisis?
Well, I mean, I think, within financial services specifically, I don't know how many individual consumers are going to feel very comfortable leaving the safety net of what they would consider a large, safe financial institution where their money is guaranteed, it's secured, they have access to it, systems don't go down. There's never going to be a problem making a payment at the grocery store. And so I actually think in some regards, the startup fintech players who are very niche focused might be in a little bit of a problem from an acquiring customers. In a good market, when things are humming and money is flowing, it's easy for someone to say, I'm going to divide my share of wallet amongst a bunch of different institutes and institutions and try different things. I'm going to see if I can save with fintech A, and if I can get a better borrowing rate with fintech B. But in a world of uncertainty, I'm not so sure that consumer sentiment is going to feel comfortable doing that. So I actually think that the large incumbents will have increased demand for their services from consumers that maybe otherwise would have shopped around. And I also think the loyalty factor is interesting. It may just be easier and safer right now for people to deal with one bank as opposed to fragmenting. So my gut is there may be some consolidation. It makes life easier in a world where you're stuck at home and you just want simplicity in your life. So that's, I think, the financial services side. I think, in other areas tied to general industry in terms of industries of growth, I think the point you just made around, Canada's often brought in people to work. I actually think it could be beneficial to now just let people live where they are, pay them in their local currency, and still have them do the work for you. And so that means that the cost of operating your business, in theory, may go down. However, I caution, and I've talked about this a lot with people lately, I'm actually really worried about the culture of the organization. I'm worried about the fact that if everybody is sitting at home 50, 70, 80, 90% of the time, and having the occasional meeting in a building, then what are all of those benefits that different organizations have been, paying for years around cool open office spaces, free lunch, snacks, paying for your transit passes in your city? If all that goes away, then you're just essentially an employee for hire. And how do you feel part of something? So I'm actually a bit more concerned overall for the sort of turnover on domestic employment, where it's like, who wants to pay me the most? I'll just do the work for you because it doesn't really matter. I'm never going to be in the office anyway.
Yeah, no, I see. That's gig economy at the extreme for jobs that haven't been today gig.
Correct. Right. So as we see less Uber, I think we may see more Uberization of general employment, and that's where big FIs and big telcos and large industry may benefit in some regard, because if you're going to have somebody not have to come into the office, why do you really care where they are anyway?
Yeah, no,
And they could be in a small town in India, and they could be in Argentina, and they could, it almost doesn't matter. And so then you come down to the third layer, which is the big winners now become the tech enablers of the communication protocols, of the file transfers, of the security mechanisms, of the preventing cyber attacks, and even of things like making sure that we can actually pay people in multiple currencies and multiple locations from an infrastructure perspective. So that's where a fintech could come in and be interesting.
So you mentioned the FIs, the traditional FIs. So where do you think these guys are going in the new normal?
Two areas. I think they're going to invest heavy, and are investing heavy, on automating and digitizing as many of the services and processes that they currently don't have digitized.
Mm-hmm.
So there are still many services in a large FI that have not been turned on for self-serve for a whole bunch of reasons. One, regulatory, like we talked about. Two, there's still a prevailing thought amongst many executive teams in large FIs that say, if I can't have a physical and real conversation, I'm never going to get the most out of the customer relationship. And, maybe, but I think that even if it's partly true, will start to go away. So I think those are two areas. One is investing heavy in and automating and digitizing. But I think on the flip side, given some of the risk sensitivity going on right now in the market, I also think you're going to see, as we've seen in the last 2 weeks with regards to the Canadian mortgage industry, we're going to see increased scrutiny and increased risk tolerance for certain types of financial products. And so the concern there is, while large FIs and banks are going to try and allow more people to service themselves, the risk is they're actually going to service less people, because they're going to crunch out the bottom of their market and open up a whole swath of Canadians that maybe are not as financially stable, be it by credit rating history and or by sort of softer income levels.
That's the worry I have with the crisis is in terms of financial inclusion, and the fact that, to your point, all these people might not be desirable clients anymore now. And okay, where do they go? So
right. So Canada's never really had as big an issue as the U.S. with regards to like the underbanked, and I think we may be creating an underbanked segment that doesn't exist today right now.
Yeah, I hear you. Changing gears, so more of a personal question. So regarding your own transformation, so did you change old habits for new habits with COVID, or are you sticking with what has been working for you?
Well, it's really hard to get up in the middle of a session between meetings and grab a coffee and talk to a few people. So that's definitely changed. It's interesting. I'm finding that the removal of the transitions between meetings and between sort of day parts, it's hard to force yourself to stop. And so it's really it's really easy to just kind of like go. So from the time you get up, so one thing I've done is I've kind of forced myself not to book meetings before 9.
Yeah.
And so I'll have breakfast at the table when I would have been commuting. Like I'll see what my kids' day is like before I actually lock myself in a room for the day. And I am trying to force myself as well to at least stop the meetings at 5. And so if I need to pick up email and stuff, I'll do it after dinner. But the time that I would have been driving and listening to music and whatever, I'm actually trying to spend a little bit more with, you know, catching up on things in the house, you know, prepping dinner. I mean, I've cooked more than I've probably cooked in 10 years. I'm not that good, but I can follow a meal kit pretty well. I think the biggest change though is I'm a social person and I do enjoy the face-to-face. And yet I do find that the video chatting in general is incredibly fatiguing. So that's something that I haven't really gotten to. And someone said to me the other day, they said the main reason is when you're sitting in meeting rooms across from people, you never have a mirror. But now when you're on all these Zoom calls, you can always see yourself in the corner. And so it's like it's screwing with our psyche. So anyway. Oh,
Yeah.
and the biggest one is I am definitely not dressing up. That's the easy.
Yeah, well, I think we're all that's going down for everyone. Do you have any questions, comments, any things that we didn't address that you want to convey maybe to our audience?
You know, I would just say this. I would say, I think, you know, when I think about, you know, you, Peggy, and I think about this whole ecosystem of, you know, consultants and experts in the field, I think what organizations need to remember is even though they have, you know, great talent and great employees, the fact that everybody's distributed, don't forget about the fact that there are specialists in certain areas that can always help your business. And don't be afraid to think about different ways to engage with, you know, peers and consultants and contractors. You know, I know we hear about the large, you know, the Deloittes of the world and the Accentures of the world. Their worlds are changing, and they're starting to figure out how to adapt their employee base to become more, you know, sort of niche players in distributed organizations. I think there's a lot of individuals like yourself who also have that value to bring, and I just think companies can't spend so much time thinking about how to just keep their existing employees engaged. They need to also still remember that there's all kinds of third parties out there that can still help to drive the business and create great, you know, client experiences for their customers. So I just don't forget there's a bigger ecosystem out there.
Thank you very much, and it was not even a plug, so I really appreciate.
No, but it's true.
Thank you. Well, thank you so much, Corby, for taking the time. Really, that was great insights. Really appreciate it, and looking forward to our next video interview on another topic probably.
Thanks, Peggy.
Thank you. Take care.
Take care.